Okay, guys, this is our video lecture, our vlecture, as it were, for King Henry IV, Parts 1, and the section that I've asked you to read in King Henry IV, Part 2. Now, this was composed around 1596 or so, and it dramatizes events from about 1412 to 1413. This is a continuation of the story begun in Richard II. Now, in this tale, the former Bolingbroke, now King Henry IV, is about 10 years into his reign, and it has not been an easy 10 years. The prophecy of sorts that Gaunt made as he was dying in Act 2 of Richard II have come true. The former Bolingbroke, now King Henry IV, has had to deal with the troubles that grew as he was usurping Richard. The troubles did not die with Richard. Discontent among the nobles has been plaguing Henry IV the entirety of his reign as this play begins. The King Henry IV plays are kind of interesting as well in that there are two stories happening. One of the stories is about the difficulties that Henry IV is having with the nobles, some of whom are revolting. The old joke, the nobles are revolting. The other story being told in both plays is a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age tale about Prince Hal in the last part of Richard II. Once Bolingbroke had become King Henry IV, there was a line in which he complained about the frivolous behavior of Prince Hal, who will be the future Henry V. And in Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, we see the change occurring as Prince Hal comes into his own and decides to become the person he will need to be in order to be king. Right away in this play, in Act 1, Scene 1, we learn that the vow Henry IV had made at the end of Richard II, a vow to go to the Holy Land, he has not been able to fulfill because he has had to deal with rebellions, or at least rebellious sentiments, among the nobles ever since he became the king. An attack is being made by Glendower on England's southern border, and there also is a rebellion in the north. The rebellion in the north is being opposed by Hotspur. Hotspur is the nickname given to Henry Percy, and Henry IV had conversed with Hotspur and his father, Northumberland, at the end of Richard II. Also, we learn in Act 1, Scene 1, that Henry remains disgruntled by the behavior of his son, Prince Hal. And in fact, there is a bit in Act 1, Scene 1, I want to say it's around line 78, maybe, in which the king laments that his son is not more like Hotspur, a warrior instead of a partier. This comparison, or this contrast of Henry Percy, Hotspur, with Prince Hal, is one that we see throughout the first part of Henry IV. The idea that King Henry has that Hotspur is a more noble, worthy individual than Prince Hal. Another character that looms large in the Henry IV plays, and that's not meant to be a pun that he looms large, is Falstaff. Falstaff is a knight, Sir John Falstaff. He is a noble. And in the original version of this play written by Shakespeare, Falstaff's name was Sir John Oldcastle, but Shakespeare changed the name of the character after the play had been performed not many times at all, because the descendants of Sir John Oldcastle were offended by the portrayal of their ancestor that they saw in the play. And well might they have been offended, because Oldcastle, whom we'll now refer to as Falstaff, since that's the name by which he is known, now. Falstaff is the exact opposite of all the other nobles. Falstaff doesn't give a damn about nobility or honor or the warrior's way or anything like that. Falstaff is completely unself-conscious. He is a coward, he is a liar, he is a criminal, and, as we shall see, he is essentially also a murderer. There are many critics who are in love with Falstaff. Harold Bloom is, or was, he might be dead now, I just don't know, one of them. And critics like to say that Falstaff is a father figure to Prince Hal. This is based primarily on Falstaff's statement in Act 2, scene, let's say scene 4, that Prince Hal is a, quote, like mine own son, end quote. Well, no, Falstaff is not a father figure to Hal, and let's not beat around the bush. Falstaff is in absolutely no way worthy of admiration. Falstaff, like many other characters who generally are presented as unsavory, including King Richard II, Falstaff does have a moment or two in which he speaks truth and in which the ideas Shakespeare puts into his mouth are ones that we might well consider. But these moments are few and far between, and they don't in any way counteract the fact that Falstaff is completely ignoble. And I don't just mean ignoble in that he doesn't embody the supposed virtues of the aristocracy. I mean, he's a son of a bitch. He's a bad human being. And Prince Hal decides, we see very early on, in fact, in this play, Henry IV, Part 1, that Prince Hal knows Falstaff is headed for a bad end. So, no, Falstaff is not a father figure to Prince Hal. In Act 1, Scene 2, in fact, Falstaff says to Prince Hal, "Do not, when thou art king, hang a thief." Falstaff, of course, meaning, don't hang someone who is a thief. Prince Hal's reply is, "No, thou shalt," meaning, thou shalt hang as a thief. So Prince Hal has no illusions about Falstaff's moral standing or his worthiness as a human being. Now, let's go to Act 2, Scene 4, late in that scene. Falstaff's elaborate pleading to Prince Hal makes critics feel sorry for Falstaff. But they overlook the fact that Falstaff only mentions anyone else in the context of saying to Hal, condemn Bardolph, condemn Peto, condemn anyone, banish them, I guess is the word Falstaff says. But don't banish poor Jack. Banish poor Jack and banish all the world. Not to put too fine a point on it, but what's that? Okay, there's a literary critical term for what Falstaff is doing here. Oh, bullshit. That's the critical literary term, okay? Falstaff is only trying to ensure his own safety. He is not representing any values or any sort of hidden, shining virtues of humankind, like many critics like to say. He's just not. Act 5, Scene 1, lines 130-ish for 10 or 15 lines. This is the only passage in which we get anything resembling sense from Falstaff. Falstaff essentially says he doesn't care about honor because honor is not going to reattach an amputated leg, or honor is not going to heal him if he gets stabbed. So this makes sense, okay? War is hideous, even if it is war that one could argue is for just cause. Nothing fun happens in it. This is the only passage, the only thing from Falstaff that in any way marks him worthy of admiration. And I would argue it doesn't mark him worthy of admiration. He's just stating a truth. Falstaff, Bardo, Peto, Mistress Quickly, other folks that Prince Hal drinks with, are sometimes said to represent the common folk by critics. But no, they don't. Now, it's true that they are more common as such than the aristocrats that we see in the play, but they are not commoners representing sort of the standard everyday behaviors and lives of people like we see in Act 3, Scene 4, I think, of Richard II. They are not worthy of admiration in any way. Now, Bardolph and Peto and Mistress Quickly and so forth, they're not evil like Falstaff is, okay? But they don't represent the standard values of common folks. In Act 1, Scene 2, Poins comes up with this elaborate plan to sort of trick Falstaff. And it doesn't serve any sense dramaturgically within the play, except to highlight what a liar and a coward Falstaff is. For in Act 2, Scene 4, Falstaff gives an account of the event that is completely at odds with what actually happened. So there's no point at all in this trick except to show that Falstaff is a liar and a coward. And as far as the notion that Falstaff is a father figure to Prince Hal, as I said, no. And Hal has no illusions about Falstaff's moral standing. And in Act 1, Scene 2, late in the scene, in fact, Hal has a soliloquy in which he says, essentially, that his behavior now is going to make him seem all the greater when he reveals his true self to the world, the self who is going to be the king. Okay, so this Hotspur Prince Hal comparison. In Act 1, Scene 3, we get a lot of stuff from Hotspur. And yes, he's honorable, I suppose, in the aristocratic version of honor that the nobles in the medieval history plays generally have. But he is also arrogant and impetuous and thoughtless. Even his father knows this. When Worcester tries to talk with Hotspur in Act 1, Scene 3, Northumberland at one point says, essentially, Hotspur, you won't shut the f*** up and listen to common sense. Aside from, or in addition to showing or beginning to show that Hotspur is not really someone who has the temperament to be a leader, in Act 1, Scene 3, we also learn that the Percys, of whom Hotspur is one, are planning to revolt against Henry IV, who the former Bolingbroke, whom they had helped become Henry IV. So Henry's got a lot of troubles. Even his former allies now are planning to rebel. In Act 4, Scene 2, we learn that Falstaff, who has been given some responsibility and money by Prince Hal, Falstaff has been put in charge of leading some troops against the rebellion. Falstaff has made lots of money, lots of extra money, because of his power to conscript people into the armed forces, essentially. We learn that Falstaff has been allowing rich people to bribe him, give him money in exchange for their becoming, or instead of their becoming members of the army. And instead, Falstaff is, pressing the poor into the army, people who have no business, no training, no interest in the rebellion. Falstaff is making the poor people pick up whatever weapons they have and serve as his ground troops, as it were. Falstaff even jokes that he knows these folks will get slaughtered. He refers to them as cannon fodder. And just a little bit later in the play, Act 5, Scene 3, we learn that Falstaff has led his troops to slaughter. And the very few that survive, we hear from Falstaff, will have to make their living as beggars because they've been maimed and they will be unable to actually do any work, any profitable employment. So these two scenes show what a creep Falstaff is. He's lying, he's murderous, he doesn't give a fig about anyone except himself. So the whole idea that Falstaff is worthy of admiration is just completely ludicrous. In fact, Act 5, Scene 4 we learn that Falstaff plays possum while the battle is going on, and then he stabs himself in the leg and pretends later that he got that injury while in battle with Hotspur, whom Falstaff says he killed. Well, Prince Hal knows damn good and well that Falstaff didn't kill Hotspur. Okay, speaking of Hotspur, let's get back to this comparison of him and Prince Hal. Act 2, Scene 3. Hotspur's focus is entirely on warfare and on his plans for the rebellion, and he explicitly rejects any concern for his wife. In Act 3, Scene 1, Hotspur badgers and is generally insolent toward Glendower, the Welsh leader of rebels, whom his father and the other folks present in the scene respect. Mortimer, for example, Hotspur's brother-in-law, respects Glendower. Hotspur doesn't. Further, Hotspur's farewell, as it were, to his wife in the scene consists entirely of sexual demands and only semi-playful teasing. Contrast this with Mortimer's behavior. Mortimer's wife is Glendower's daughter. She speaks Welsh. Mortimer speaks English in the play. They don't even speak the same language, and yet Mortimer manages to convey concern and tenderness to his wife. Quite the opposite of Hotspur. Now, Act 3, Scene 2, we have a bit where the king scolds Prince Hal, saying essentially that Hotspur is a far more worthy young man than Hal is, much as the king said back in Act 1. And of course, we, the audience, are already learning that this is not true. The king is laboring under a delusion. And in Act 3, Scene 2, starting at line, 160 or so, we see Hal's real turning point. He vows to change his ways and to become the individual that he must become in order to be king. Now, back to the story of Henry and his problems, King Henry IV. Things are falling apart for Henry, but things are also falling apart for the rebels, specifically the Percy family, as we see in Act 4, Scene 1. Glendower, we learn, will not be joining them. Northumberland is sick and can't come. Forces, with Prince Hal in the lead, we learn are coming on strong, and Prince Hal in particular is spoken of in glowing terms regarding his prowess in battle and his leadership. Now, Act 4, Scene 3, starting about line 50, we finally hear the reason behind the Percy family's rebellion. Hotspur makes very clear that, in short, he feels King Henry has not displayed the proper amount of gratitude toward the folks who helped him become the king. And that lack of gratitude is the reason for rebellion. Okay, now, as I have mentioned in other lectures and is evident in Shakespeare's history plays, both English and Roman, Shakespeare takes great pains to make rebellion, even rebellion against a king who sucks, which Henry IV apparently doesn't, rebellion seem problematic at best because, well, everybody was very uneasy about the prospect of rebellion. You just don't revolt against the king because that creates problems kingdom-wide. So, if rebellion is going to be shown in Shakespeare's plays, as indeed it is, Shakespeare takes pains both to make the rebellion seem justified and yet also to make the folks doing the rebelling seem on precarious moral or ethical grounds. Okay, Act 5, Scene 1. Prince Hal issues a challenge for single combat to be sent to Hotspur, and Prince Hal does this, we see, hoping to avoid the massive loss of life that would occur if battle between the masses of troops were to happen. Now, Hotspur never even gets this proposal, and he would have rejected it anyway, but Prince Hal's trying to avoid loss of life. It's a pretty worthy thing, and this idea that Hal is aware of the loss of life and the atrocity of warfare is one that we'll see in Henry V as well. All right, jumping on to part 2 of Henry IV, and the section that I ask you to read, which is Act 4 and following. In Act 4, Scene 2, we learn that Henry IV is very sick. He is taken to his deathbed. His sons, Clarence and Gloucester, both observe ill omens. In Act 4, Scene 5, Prince Hal comes upon the sleeping king, and Prince Henry is sleeping in such a manner that Hal thinks he is dead. So Hal takes the crown off of his father and puts it on himself and voices his determination to be the king that he needs to be. Well, once Prince Hal leaves the room, Henry IV wakes up and is like, "Oh my God." And when Hal comes back in, Henry accuses Hal of wishing that he, Henry, were dead. And we get essentially a repeat of the same scolding that Henry IV gave to Prince Hal in the first part of Henry IV. And again, we get Hal's statement that he is going to mend his ways and be kingly from now on. Now, during this conversation, Henry admits the troubles that he has faced ever since he became king, and that they have stemmed from the questionable means by which he became king. And Act 4, Scene 5, around line 215, we get Henry's famous advice to Prince Hal: busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels. In other words, direct the attention of the nobles to foreign enemies, or whom you can make to seem like foreign enemies, so that the nobles will focus on that instead of on any gripes they have about their status at home. Okay, let's go to Act 5, Scene 2. King Henry IV is dead. Prince Hal now is, or is very shortly going to be, officially King Henry V. The Chief Justice of London, who is the chief sort of law enforcement officer, is afraid that the now King Henry V is going to punish him. But the opposite happens. Hal, Henry V, thanks the justice for being hard on him. Says he was right to be in his riotous days. Now, the Falstaffoids, or the Falstaffians, read this scene as showing that Prince Hal Henry V is cold and unfeeling toward his father figure, Falstaff. As we took care of a few minutes ago, Falstaff is not and never was a father figure to Prince Hal. And in Act 5, Scene 5, the former Prince Hal orders Falstaff to keep his distance. Now, the Falstaffoids, again, they point to the scene and say, "See how mean and cruel the new king is being to his former father figure." But the Falstaffoids just conveniently always failed to mention that Prince Hal not only gives Falstaff a road to redemption, he says, "As you improve yourself, then we'll see about you coming back into my presence." He even gives Falstaff a pension so that Falstaff will not have to resort to theft, to thievery, in order to support himself. But the Falstaffians just miss that entirely. Okay, y'all, that's what I've got for parts 1 and 2 of King Henry IV. Talk to you again very soon.